Good afternoon, and welcome to the global launch of International Ideas Global State of Democracy 2024 report, Strengthening the Legitimacy of Elections in a Time of Radical Uncertainty. I'm Jessica Keyhays, Chief of Staff to the Secretary General of International IDEA. As many of you know, the Global State of Democracy report is International IDEA's flagship publication, offering an annual health check of democracy by analyzing 173 countries worldwide. For the launch of this year's 6th edition, we have prepared an engaging program that includes a presentation of the report's key findings, a panel discussion featuring distinguished speakers, and a Q&A session. To start, Dr. Kevin Casas Zamora, Secretary General of International IDEA, will deliver the opening remarks. Kevin.
Thank you, Jessica, and hello and welcome all to this launch of International Ideas 2024 Global State of Democracy report. It's great to see and to know that so many of you are joining us from all over the world. I'm Kevin Casas Zamora, the Secretary General of International IDEA. For any of you who are not so familiar with our institute, we are an intergovernmental organization with 35 member states from all regions dedicated to advancing, promoting, and protecting sustainable democracy globally. As part of this mandate, we have an important role as one of the leading voices in assessing the quality and performance of democracies around the world. Every year, these efforts culminate in the presentation and the publication of our flagship report, the Global State of Democracy, which is the reason that brings us here today. Today, I hope to do three things. First, I want to give you a sense of why and how International IDEA assesses democratic performance. Second, I will share an overview of how our work in this area continues to evolve. And finally, I would like to give you a glimpse of this year's main findings as a preview to the presentation that will follow. International IDEA's Global State of Democracy initiative is a unique combination of comparative data, timely analysis, and policy-relevant publications. We aim to reflect global, regional, and country-level trends while also capturing emerging phenomena with the potential to impact the state of democracy. We do this work because we believe that evaluating the state of democracy is necessary to protect it and to improve it. I want to emphasize that we're only able to provide this analysis because many of our member states take this work seriously in many different ways, including by supporting it through their contributions to our Institute's core budget. This support allows us to continue and to continuously improve. And this brings me to the second part of my remarks about the changes to the Global State of Democracy report this year. And I want to highlight 3 points. The first is that we have preserved the more nuanced approach that we introduced last year. We now assess democratic performance at country level in 4 categories of representation, rights, rule of law, and participation, rather than classifying countries on an overall basis. This approach acknowledges that nations perform at different levels in different categories and are not well served by an overarching regime classification that puts a label on their general democratic performance. The second change, which is new this year, concerns the format of the report. To bring greater attention and focus to our policy recommendations, we are now structuring the report around a theme. The first part of the report, as always, is an assessment of how democracy is performing globally. illustrated through cases from all over the world, as well as tables showing countries' relative performance in each of the four categories that I just mentioned. The second part of the report is a thematic policy paper, illuminating a specific issue or phenomenon or trend, and providing policy recommendations related to it. This new format enhances the report's policy relevance on themes of importance to the Institute and to democracy, while also highlighting the rich experience and diversity of international ideas, presence, staff, and work around the world. I'll say more about this year's theme and related findings in a second. But first, let me note one other key aspect of the latest report. This year, more than ever before, our report relies on International Ideas Democracy Tracker, launched in 2022 as a constantly evolving qualitative complement to the annual quantitative Global State of Democracy indices. Our analysis now draws on both sources, ensuring that it reflects recent events as well as longer-term trends. I am very proud that the tracker has quickly become a key reference tool for the global democracy community. In fact, last year, its first full year of operation, it was viewed close to 250,000 times. These three changes to our report and the further changes that are likely to come in future years are a recognition that if we want our work measuring and monitoring democratic performance to remain relevant, we cannot afford to simply continue producing the same reports as we have done in the past. The reports on the state of democracy that we have put out have always been very good, arguably the best in the field. But they also face increasingly stiff competition to be read and used. And the truth is that they have been broadly similar to other reports out there. The changes we're now introducing reflect our comparative advantages. Innovative tools like the Democracy Tracker, a unique combination of qualitative and quantitative sources, and rich technical expertise backed by insights from our work on the ground. To the extent that our report reflects the think, do, learn nature of the Institute, they will have a much better chance of being interesting, relevant, and actually used by their intended audiences. Finally, against this background, let me share with you a few highlights from this year's report. As many of you know, International IDEA has had a strategic focus this year on election integrity. At the start of 2024, as countries with half the world's population prepared to go to the polls, we resolved to redouble our focus on the need to protect democratic elections. We have been delivering on this commitment by developing the capacity of election authorities to manage risk, by convening dialogues to exchange practices among our member states, and by leveraging our voice through media and advocacy. Yet, one of the most important contributions that our Institute can make on any topic is to generate and disseminate knowledge about the trends that we are seeing and the lessons to be drawn. Hence, our decision to focus the 2024 Global State of Democracy report's thematic analysis on the challenges faced by electoral authorities and systems. In particular, this report explores how public perceptions about the integrity of elections are created and how those perceptions in turn shape democratic outcomes. This is part of a broader effort by our democracy assessment team to give more emphasis in our analysis to public perceptions of democracy. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out the fascinating results of a public opinion survey that we ran on perceptions of democracy in 19 countries worldwide, which we released last April. As with all our publications, the report is available on our website. This year, Global State of Democracy report places concerns about election integrity in the context of a broader struggle for democracy. The story of democratic decline, which we have been telling for too long, continues, unfortunately. The proportion of countries experiencing democratic deterioration over the past 5 years far exceeds those witnessing improvements. What's more, we see these challenges in all parts of the world and at every level of democratic performance. Many countries that had it bad already are getting worse, while some of the world's most robust democracies face mounting threats. Some of the most serious difficulties we observe are in areas of representation and rights, two categories of democratic performance that underpin electoral integrity. Yet perhaps the most striking result is in terms of participation, a dramatic 10-point fall in average electoral turnout for over the past 15 years. In contrast, the new data set in this report shows that rates of election-related contestation have been rising, as have cases where losing candidates or parties refuse to accept electoral outcomes. Some of these complaints are grounded in legitimate grievances, but the growing incidence of unfounded election denialism is deeply concerning. Yet, if problems with elections are part of the challenge facing democracy today, our report also underscores that elections are an essential part of the solution. This big elections year has reinforced that elections remain the single best opportunity to revert democratic backsliding and turn the tide in democracy's favor. As shown recently in places from Zambia to Guatemala, from Brazil to Poland, elections retain a remarkable ability to reassert and strengthen democracy in the face of adversity. Indeed, there may be no better expression of democratic vitality than a well-managed election with a result that surprises the experts. As the complex methodology behind this report shows, the success of democracy depends on many things. Yet, democracy becomes utterly impossible if elections fail. In their survival writes the future of the entire democratic project. This report is International IDEA's latest contribution to that end. With that, I'm now pleased to hand the floor over to our head of democracy assessment, my colleague, Dr. Seema Shah, to present the 2024 Global State of Democracy report. Thank you again for being here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us today and joining us in the launch of International IDEA's flagship report, The Global State of Democracy. This year's report, Strengthening the Legitimacy of Elections in a Time of Radical Uncertainty, provides an overview of global trends and then presents new research on one of the most pressing policy questions of our time. What drives people's perceptions of electoral integrity, and what explains the growing mistrust in election outcomes? Before we start, it's important to contextualize our findings in the current moment, 9 months into a global supercycle year of elections. By the end of 2024, there will have been about 70 national elections in every region of the world, from small microstates like Tuvalu to regional giants like India. 2024 will have called almost 3 billion voters to the polls, and that call has been answered. So far, the supercycle year has seen the first woman to have been elected president in Mexico, Africa's youngest elected president in Senegal, a landslide win for the UK's Labour Party, the first in 14 years, an election in Guatemala marked by turbulent efforts to unseat the leader who won the most votes, and a dramatic last-minute change to the presidential ticket in the United States, where there have now been 2 assassination attempts against a presidential contender. Apathy, which International IDEA's Council of Member States raised as one of its top concerns years ago, seems to be at bay. This is our definition of democracy on the screen. It is based on 2 key principles: popular control over decision makers and equality in the exercise of that control. We divide the concept into 4 broad categories: representation, rights, rule of law, and participation. As you can see, each of these categories has a number of associated factors, and underneath those are the source indicators. This quantitative data set is updated once a year and now includes economic equality, which you can see there on the right, as a new factor under rights. Altogether, this quantitative data set measures 165 individual indicators of democratic quality across 173 countries, and it is based on an aggregation of 24 of the most credible and sophisticated data sets on indicators of democracy and human rights. As Kevin said, this focus on performance at the category and factor level, rather than on regime classifications, allows us to more meaningfully look at change, identify areas of progress and decline, and create more targeted policy recommendations. This year, in addition to our Global State of Democracy Indices data set, our Global State of Democracy report, the analysis inside it, is based on our EU co-funded Democracy Tracker, which also covers those same 173 countries, but provides updates on a monthly basis, showing users how specific events impact the status quo of democracy and rights at the country level. It is also based on our Perceptions of Democracy survey, which looks at popular views of the quality and performance of political institutions and democratic values, and of course, as always, on our regional and country-based experts who provide invaluable insights from the contexts that we are talking about. The rest of this presentation will proceed as follows. I'll start with an overview of global trends. I will then follow this up with an in-depth look at what we found in our original research conducted about perceptions of electoral integrity around the world, and I will end with an overview of our policy recommendations. Let's start by looking at global trends. In an age of radical uncertainty, marked by climate change and climate disasters, a surge in migration flows, increasing armed conflict, and transformations driven by digitalization and the use of artificial intelligence, we see clear effects on the quality of democracy. First, compared to 5 years ago, the number of countries with at least one significant decline in a key factor of democratic quality is far greater than the number of countries experiencing at least one advance. Examples include declines in factors like access to justice across Europe and in freedom of the press and freedom of expression in the Americas. This also includes cases like France, Fiji, and Brazil, which have all seen advances in civil society, including metrics of how engaged a society is and the degree to which governments consult with civil society. In addition to declines in weaker contexts, democratically high-performing countries in all regions have suffered significant deterioration, especially in Europe and in the Americas. Some examples include the United States, Guyana, Czechia, Greece, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. Declines have been most concentrated in factors associated with representation and rights. What you see here on the screen are boxes that represent all the factors that we measure. Each box represents all 173 countries that we cover. The gray indicates the number of countries that have not experienced a significant change in the last 5 years. The red shows you the number of countries that have experienced declines, and the blue shows you the number that have experienced advances. As you can see, it is credible elections and effective parliament under representation, and economic equality, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press under rights that have seen the most deterioration. Serbia provides an example of the drop in credible elections. While these elections have long been tainted by excessive incumbency advantages, the 2023 election was notable as observers pointed to electoral manipulation that extended right to election day, including examples of blatant vote buying and ballot box stuffing. Mid-range performing Greece has experienced problems with academic freedom, exemplified by a new law that allows for scrutiny of students who display banners on campus and allows for a new police force to help maintain order on university campuses. This law has created a lot of controversy, sparking protests and concerns about declines in freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Mid-range performing United States has also experienced declines in the factor of economic equality, driven by unequal respect for civil liberties based on social class, and the denial of access to services and participation based on identity. Even a very robust democracy like Portugal has experienced deterioration in these factors over the last 5 years. The historic gains made by the far-right party in elections earlier this year, due in part to the enthusiasm of young voters, is a sign of what a significant moment this is for the country. The hegemony of two-party dominance is fading, as voters show a clear demand for different alternatives. The fact that this is happening in such a strong democracy like Portugal shows us that the challenges to democracy are emerging all over the world and in a range of countries with varying levels of performance. Participation remains a relative bright spot. Though there are declines, the number of declines is far fewer compared to drops in other categories. Here you can see the number of countries advancing and declining in civic engagement and civil society, two key factors under participation. As you can see in civic engagement, it's only recently that the number of declining countries outweighs the number of advancing countries. But hope remains here. In Slovenia, Civicus points to new initiatives to promote increased dialogue and cooperation between government and civil society. Experts note a more open environment for CSOs and accountabilities being pursued in the wake of attacks against certain activists. These long-standing declines and the uncertainty surrounding them take on new meaning in 2024, an election supercycle year. Here on the screen, you can see the landing page for our institute-wide initiative on electoral integrity. Our data show that today, 1 in 3 voters live in a country where the quality of elections has declined compared to 5 years ago. That amounts to 1 billion voters, more than the population of all of Europe. This drop has occurred in all regions, though the most examples can be found in Africa, followed by Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Our Perceptions of Democracy survey, released earlier this year, also shows that in 11 of the 19 countries we looked at, less than half of the respondents expressed confidence in the most recent election. In 17 of those 19 countries, it's less than 2/3 of respondents who feel this way. When you put that together, declining quality of elections and decreased confidence in the outcome of the election, it is not surprising that there are more protests and riots related to the electoral process. This graph shows you that stark and concerning trend. But what it also shows you is that people are still engaged with their polls. It just may be that that engagement takes place more on the streets than it does through voting. Does that mean that the ballot box has lost its power? It's a question policymakers must prioritize in the years ahead. What explains people's decreasing trust in outcomes? This year, we examined this question in detail, interrogating the scientific literature and collecting new data on disputed elections. Some of the best known and rigorous academic data show us that there are several drivers of electoral integrity which can be found across the electoral cycle. The Electoral Integrity Project reveals that vote tabulation and the announcement of results have historically been among the least problematic stages of the cycle. These are some of the strongest aspects of the electoral cycle, according to this data. Of course, voters and citizens have their own opinions, and in many cases, they don't align with those of the experts. In fact, our survey found some striking gaps between popular and expert views. Here you can see some of those correlations. On the horizontal axis are what our experts consider to be the scores for credible elections, ranging from low to high range performance. On the vertical axis, you can see the proportion of people who agreed or that expressed confidence in the last election in their country. Pay attention to Tanzania, Taiwan, and Romania. In Tanzania, experts consider the level of electoral credibility to be quite low, but 80% of Tanzanians express confidence in their last election. Compare that with Romania and Taiwan, which experts consider to be mid to high range in performance, but where relatively low levels of the population have expressed confidence in the last election. These differences are even more stark when it comes to minority communities, whether that's racial, ethnic, religious, or gender-based. And you can see these differences especially in the countries displayed on the screen. If you look at the green dots, those represent minority groups. They are less likely to say that they trusted the last election and more likely to say that they did not trust it. One way to understand more about what drives these perceptions is to look closely at the ways in which political elites who represent voters and certain sections of the electorate express their distrust of a result or an electoral process. We looked at all national elections taking place between 2020 and 2024, and we investigated how many of those included different forms of disputes, including boycotts, public rejections of the result, and legal challenges. In 20% of elections between 2020 and 2024, a losing candidate or party rejected the outcome in at least one of these ways or in multiple ways. That's 1 in 5 elections. And what drives these disputes? In order to answer this question, we took a close look at the legal challenges to see what the grounds of litigation were. And as you can see on the screen, there were lots of things that drove legal challenges. But perceptions about voting and vote counting were by far the most common ground for taking a case to court. This is despite the fact that, like I said just a few minutes ago, experts consider these phases of the electoral cycle to be among the strongest. So why do voters and parties seem to mistrust these parts of the cycle? There are many reasons, of course. First, voting and vote counting are some of the primary points at which voters interact with their election, and so problems here might have particular resonance with voters. It could also be that these problems are much easier to see, document, understand, and present to a court than others. It may be that expert concerns, which tend to concentrate around things like campaign finance and campaign media, are not priorities for the public because most voters don't have a great deal of personal experience with those phenomena, and therefore don't personally feel the impact of the poor regulations behind them. The prevalence of social media today also means that voters and the public can much more easily express their thoughts, including their doubts and questions about the electoral process with masses of people instantaneously. As a result, there may be cases in which issues or errors receive a disproportionate amount of unmerited attention. At the same time, of course, it's also important to emphasize that other, broader drivers of public perceptions exist, many of which are well outside the ability of electoral authorities to address, including things like trust in and satisfaction with government and the impact of polarized contexts. So what should we do? We recommend that electoral management bodies acknowledge and respond to public opinion by incorporating public perception into operational planning more than they already do. Since voters pay more attention to these phases of the electoral cycle, we encourage EMBs to be particularly attentive to how access to voting and vote counting may impact perceptions. It is important to access regular public polling data, engage consistently with leading civil society organizations and academics, and to use election workers, especially at the local level, to understand what people and voters are thinking about. We also recommend that any electoral reforms are introduced with great care, only after wide consultation and planning for accidental errors and with as much political consensus as possible. EMBs and legislators should carefully consider the costs and benefits, and especially the unintended consequences that may occur, and the political impacts of perceptions based on those unintended consequences. Perhaps most importantly, we recommend that EMBs continue to prioritize consistent and meaningful communication with the public. Given the heightened sensitivity around the voting process, it's important to emphasize that communications are more important than ever for EMBs. Their work is technical, of course, but it is also importantly political. EMBs are part of the first line of defense of electoral integrity. EMBs should therefore work within well-established broad ecosystems of partners, including CSOs, media, the courts, and other institutions that can collectively devote more resources to consistent and comprehensive communication with the public. When voters and citizens know their EMB, it increases the chance of public trust. The Philippines offers a good example here. Despite concerns and criticism about electronic voting over the years, serious declines in public confidence have been averted due to the EMB's and other stakeholders' careful attention to public education and communication over time. The authorities there oversaw a public acceptance program that aimed to educate the electorate about electronic voting, and the country's 3 major television networks considered the dissemination about this electronic voting technology to be part of their corporate social responsibility. We further recommend that all political institutions who are involved in the electoral cycle respond vigilantly to election denialism, marked by unfounded accusations that seek to harm perception of electoral integrity. Institutions with the authority to deal with libelous statements should make it clear that there will be consequences for those who make false accusations without credible evidence. Election denialism is not a couple of random cases. It is becoming a global phenomenon with the continuing ramifications of the January 2021 events in the United States, threatening the foundational role of elections to democratic systems. Regional and international bodies should create increased capacity devoted to rigorous research, reflection, and learning throughout the electoral cycle, with a special emphasis on public perception. International IDEA in this regard reiterates its previous recommendation that the United Nations and/or regional bodies should consider creating a special rapporteur on the credibility of electoral processes. This rapporteur could, for example, draw attention to attacks on EMBs, monitor the protection of the independence of EMBs, and make critical recommendations to other actors involved in the electoral cycle. Election observers should also integrate public opinion information more systematically into research and preparation. Analysis of the public's views on electoral integrity through the election cycle may promote greater understanding. Relying solely on the views of EMBs and experts could result in a skewed picture of the election environment. All of us, and especially donors, should support more research on both the reality and range of perceptions of electoral management. In closing, this era of radical uncertainty can be destabilizing, but such times are known to also open doors for innovation and renewal. What our research shows is that people still care, especially about elections. Their engagement and questioning reflects not apathy, but concern and investment. This engagement is also testament to the fact that elections continue to be the cornerstones of healthy, thriving democracies. If nothing else, this is a call to action for all of us who care about the future of democracy to pay attention and do whatever we can to address and understand public concerns, and to channel this public energy into shaping a new vision of democracy for the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. Thank you, Seema, for presenting the key findings of the Global State of Democracy report. Your summary of the global trends, the factors contributing to growing dissatisfaction with elections, and the analysis of the drivers behind perceptions of electoral integrity, along with the actionable recommendations toward the stakeholders, provided valuable insights into safeguarding public confidence in electoral integrity. With much to reflect on following this presentation, we now move to the panel discussion that will delve deeper into the overall state of democracy and electoral integrity. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Massimo Tomasoli, Director of Global Programs at International IDEA. Massimo.
Thank you very much, Jessica. and thank you to all, and especially our two panelists who are joining us today. Let me briefly introduce them. We have here, first of all, Dr. Ines Pusadella, who is a senior research specialist at Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and then Tom Rogers, who is the Australian Electoral Commissioner. And I think that in the agenda you can have access to their quite impressive short bios. I would like to briefly recall two elements here. One is an element of continuity with respect to last year's Global State of Democracy report. We focused last year on countervailing institutions, and the focus of this year on electoral processes calls the public attention to the role of especially electoral management bodies, the election authorities, as guarantors institutions. And this contributes to trust in the electoral processes, trust in the outcomes, or lack of trust or reduction in the support of the electoral outcomes. This will be one element of conversation with the panel. And of course, in the broad range of countervailing institutions, we have also civil society and other political institutions as well. And the second element I wanted to recall is the importance and relevance of this conversation to global conversations. And I will just make reference to a recent perception survey carried out by the World Economic Forum. It's the Global Risks Perception Survey. And 2 out of the 5 top global risks perceived in the respondents to this survey are related to the analysis we carried out in our report this year. Number 2 in the rank is AI-generated misinformation and disinformation, which has been perceived as a threat to many electoral processes. And number 3 in the top 5 global risks is societal and or political polarization, which is really at the core of the conversation I would like to have with our two panelists today. Before asking them a few questions and then opening up for questions and answers from the global audience, I would like to remind that everybody can actually submit questions on the YouTube channel, and I will receive these questions on my desk, and then I will open up at the end of the conversation with the panelists to your questions to them. So let me start and kick off this conversation with Tom Rogers. And I will ask the same question to you also, Ines. How do you see the global state of democracy today, particularly with regard to elections? Tom?
Massimo, just confirm you can hear me clearly as I'm talking.
Clear and loud. Thank you.
Great. Look, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And Seema, thank you very much for your presentation. The report is excellent. And maybe I might answer your question by starting off by saying that as a practitioner, we need this sort of research to help us to be better guarantors of electoral integrity. Research is critical. And if I reflect on my own organisation, we are a doctrine-led and data-driven organisation, and research like this is so important. And Kevin, if I might also give you a shout out for the selection of the kind of strategic focus on electoral integrity is critical for all of us and critical for election management bodies. If I look at the state of democracy today, particularly with regard to elections, we see what the report has highlighted, very largely growing levels of mistrust, and also election management bodies needing to step well outside their traditional role of delivering a statistically valid election to also helping to manage the very robust and fertile information ecosystem that's having such an impact on citizens' perceptions of elections. And if I reflect on my own time, and Kevin, I know you know this, but I'm in my 11th and final year as Commissioner, and I've run a large number of electoral events. It used to be enough for us to run a really good election, and that's no longer the case, as we see with the report that's being launched this evening. We see increasing levels of mis and disinformation. We've become caught up in the global argument about censorship and freedom of expression, which is so critical, and the need to really engage with citizens in ways that we've never done previously. For us, we've recently launched an initiative called Voter 2030. It's an arbitrary date, but it's designed for us to actually take the position of the citizen looking into the electoral system, rather than, as we've always done, just design something we think the citizen wants. And this report reflects the complexity of the need for us to include citizen-centric planning in everything we're doing to maintain those high levels of trust all the time. So for me, election management has become very complex. We say in Australia that running the election is probably the most complex peacetime logistic event in the life of our nation. These new issues that are emerging, including managing the information ecosystem, if anything, are making it even more difficult. Two final things before I finish. Something we've never seen before, but the report brings out very clearly. Election management bodies are being influenced by global trends in a way that we never have been previously. Things that are occurring in overseas democracies. And if you don't mind, as a serving commissioner, I won't mention any particular country, but when we look at big democratic incidents overseas, we see issues that then bleed into our own management of elections. And then the final piece of how we see elections is the issue of uncertainty. I haven't spoken this evening about AI, but this is a new area. As the report shows, people are worried about it. We're worried about it. I've said publicly in Australia that as the election management body, we don't have the legislative tools or technical ability yet to be able to manage this in a reasonable way, and it's worrying. So to summarise, trust and integrity remain critical. The report is excellent, but we're heading into a very uncertain period and elections are becoming even more complex.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you for focusing on these critical points. But I would like to hear from Ines Pusadella about the same issue. What do you think from a civil society, citizens engagement perspective about the global state of democracy with focus on these electoral processes? Over to you.
Well, thank you. And first of all, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to read your report, although it was a little bit unsettling at times, but it resonated a lot with me. And it really made a lot of sense. It helped me make sense of a lot of things. I think it highlights some elements that are critical for the survival of democracy. So thank you. So as to your question, short answer, I would say it's complicated. Complicated means compromised, but not hopeless. As you have said a few times, the number of countries regressing has exceeded the number of countries making progress in their democratic practices and institutions for, well, several years now in a row, to the point that we can now say that the third wave of democratization that opened the longest and just biggest democratic expansion period in history is now over. So we're going through the inevitable counter wave, right? And that's bad. It means things will probably continue to get worse before they start to get better. Well, as you also highlighted, democracy is not limited to elections. But no matter which definition of democracy you choose, elections are at its core. And not just any kind of elections, but free and fair elections. Elections characterized by ex ante uncertainty, but ex post irreversibility, right? This means, democracy is a system of organized uncertainty. There are rules, there are set rules. Players can't know for sure the outcome of the elections before they happen, but then once they happen, they cannot change the results. And the election happen periodically, so outcomes are always transitory. Nobody remains the winner or the loser forever, right? So it's basically a system where rulers can lose and they can be replaced without bloodshed. And if you think about it, this is an incredible invention. It's a historical novelty as well. So in the big scheme of things, when it comes to experimenting with democracy, I think we're only getting started. But right now, and maybe for decades now to come, democracy is in decline, right? And democratic regression is taking various forms. There are some old forms of democratic breakdown, like military coups, that they seem to be back. And military rule is becoming normalized in some parts of the world. And we thought that was, something of the past, but it seems it's not. And what we've seen the last couple of years is that none of the countries that that had military coups in recent years are showing any signs that they'll return to civilian rule anytime soon. So this is a problem. I think conflict is at the core of much of this regression. And this is something you have already mentioned as well. But and conflict is rising. It's worth noting that around the world, 1 in 6 people now are currently exposed to conflict, right? And conflict-related deaths are at the highest level in decades. So it's obviously not surprising that the justification used by military leaders to take or retain power in several countries in Central and West Africa has been the ineffectiveness of civilian governments in dealing with insurgency, for instance, right? Conflict is also making elections impossible in places like Sudan or Ukraine. In Russia, responsible for the war in Ukraine, war has also brought intensified repression of domestic dissent. So it resulted in a non-competitive election that rubber-stamped the president's rule. So and then in other parts of the world, there's security threats of a different kind, like gang violence. Like the kind of conflict that prompted El Salvador's slide towards populist authoritarianism. And this is a very different form of democratic regression in which elections are actually at the center. Backsliding is happening through the erosion of freedoms and institutional checks and balances by very popular, democratically elected populist authoritarians. These people claim to speak in the name of the people. They insist that they need to concentrate power to deal with crisis. And then we're also seeing, several authoritarian regimes that experience mass protest movements in recent years, from Iran to Nicaragua. They have regained their footing. They just became even more authoritarian. And then non-democratic states of various kinds that continue to hold elections in which the autocratic power is never in question. So, there are many parts of the world where voting is ceremonial, and it basically seeks to add a veneer of legitimacy to autocratic rule. Then there's also countries with systems that combine, in various degrees, democratic and authoritarian traits. Some call them hybrid regimes. Yeah, we don't put labels here, but and they hold elections with somewhat, less predetermined results. There's at least some chance that the ruling party will be defeated, and of course, I would say incumbent advantage is reflected in the fact that change rarely happens, but there's hope here because sometimes it does, right? And then there's also the troubling situation in many countries that you have also mentioned, that they have free and fair elections, and voters are using those opportunities to express disappointment with what democracy basically has offered them so far. And they are more and more willing to embrace extremist far-right ideas that sort of appear to them as new, radical, anti-elite. But in many cases, they don't do this. And, there's lots of cases of broad progressive coalitions that are stopping this regression. So I would say just, to summarize, and I'm sorry if I'm getting like too long, but, I think the outlook is grim, but it's not game over for democracy because, and this is where our sort of intrinsic optimism comes in. I think it's not a game over because many haven't given up on democracy. Citizens, civil society organizations, political parties, they continue to press for governments to call overdue elections, for elections to take place in free and fair conditions, for people to have the information they need to make informed choices in elections, then for votes to be properly counted, for losers to accept when they lose, and for winners to then, just go on to rule with respect for rights and freedoms and institutions. So there it goes. I mean, the glass is sort of half full, I would say. Yeah, that's all from me.
I'm also in half full glasses in a way, so I tend to be optimist by mandate, but truly I think that there are some signs of hope, as you indicated, and Tom also remarked. Let me pose you another question. Beyond what you have just mentioned, what stood out for you in the 2024 Global State of Democracy report of this year? Maybe we can get back to Tom on this.
Massimo, I might just take a practitioner's perspective here, if I might, and cherry pick a piece of the report that really resonated for me. I know it's not particularly strategic, but it's so important. It's a clarion call from the report to get election management bodies to still focus on those essential parts of running the election, those touch points with the citizen, to make sure we're doing that well. And as the report makes clear, vote tabulation remains a critical issue. We have a mantra where we are looking at those touch points that citizens see and are so important to foster the idea of electoral integrity. For us, there are things like making sure there are no unforced and small errors even in the transcription of results, doing that in a very transparent way. A critical thing in Australia, and maybe different elsewhere, is the speed of the count. I have seen overseas issues where if the count drags on for too long, it fosters conspiracy theories about what must be going on behind the scenes. And for us, we've spent a fair bit of time on that issue to try and make sure that the count is as quick as possible. And the report says that. So, and just to quote the report back about talking about multiple complex drivers of public perceptions of integrity, and the EMB not having its hands on all of those levers, we do still have to focus on the levers we do have our hands on, and it's critical. And just because I've got the floor, if I was to throw one in from an Australian perspective, which is peculiarly Australian, it's queuing, lining up for the election. Australians have lost the ability to queue, and when we queue for elections, if the queue's long, it also brings out a public perception that something's wrong with the election. So the report for me, what bounced out were those touch points of service delivery. As an EMB, we can't lose sight of those, even though we now have to do extra things in managing the information ecosystem. And I thought it was a clarion call for election management bodies to remember that and to do so. That was what jumped out for me, Massimo.
Extremely interesting. Let me pose the same question now to Ines. What do you think struck you the most out of this report?
Okay, well, first, I wanted to highlight, the sort of the tone, which is quite grim, but invites action rather than despair, and that's really important. So there's one thing first, that's not specifically about this latest edition of the report, but more about your sort of conceptualization and operationalization of democracy, the rejection of broader classifications of regime in favor of an analysis of indicators in various areas of democratic performance. That's not the way I'm used to thinking about it, but I found it really important, interesting. I thought it was it's key if the purpose is to identify areas for improvement and specific measures that would help tackle specific problems. Yeah, that's really something to highlight. But regarding the content of this specific report, there's basically maybe two things I would like to highlight. So first, the finding that you presented, that democratic declines have been concentrated mostly in these two areas of representation and rights. And then in representation, specifically in the dimensions of credible elections and effective parliamentary institutions, which, as far as I understood, it means the parliament that can effectively control and hold the executive accountable, right? And then rights, and then in the dimension of rights, the focus is on economic equality, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press, right? So the way I see it, this takes us back to sort of the basics. It is the most basic elements that make up democracy that are under attack. Elections, which are the core of even the narrowest definition of democracy, and what at Civicus we call civic space. The physical and virtual space in which civil society exists and where the dissent can emerge. This space that's structured by the freedoms of association, expression, and peaceful assembly. And this represents the bare minimum contextual freedoms that ensure that elections can be free and fair, right? And then the element of economic equality is also interesting. And that's, I heard it's a new element that he introduced this year. It also takes us back to the philosophical basics, I would say, to Rousseau's fundamental intuition about political autonomy, which requires, at the very least, that no citizen is poor enough to be forced to sell themselves. And actually, he also says that no citizen should be wealthy enough to buy other people, right? Other people's will. And this couldn't be more relevant today, I think, as the wealth gap grows to like unbelievable levels, and multiple crises are impacting negatively on the life opportunities enjoyed by the majority of the people. And there are individuals who, because of their wealth, hold more power than many of the world's countries' leaders. So these economic and social processes obviously have tremendous political consequences. And the other element that stood out for me is a focus on the credibility of elections that, we have already heard a lot about, but the relationship between electoral integrity, which can be sort of objectively assessed, and then credibility, which depends on subjective factors. That was really enlightening to me. I think legitimacy requires both. Of course, electoral processes must have integrity. Elections must be free, fair, clean, honest, and so on. But that's not enough. Appearances matter as much as, if not more than, reality itself. There must be integrity, but there must also be a perception of integrity and a belief in that integrity. So, we know this legitimacy and the belief in legitimacy are basically the same thing. So, yeah, that's really an incredible insight, and I hadn't thought of it in that way. But yeah, half the report revolves around these issues. So I suppose we can have a more in-depth conversation about this in the next minutes. So I will stop here.
Thank you, Ines. In fact, this links also to what Tom just said about the role of electoral authorities. And one of the recommendations that comes out from the report about the need to invest in communication and information as well. One of the things that Seema summarized at the end. And by the way, both Seema and Kevin may participate in the Q&A, I'm pretty sure, and reading their body languages, I would say that they are willing to intervene. We'll have another, a little bit less than 10 minutes before we open up for the Q&A. We have started to receive questions on YouTube, but I invite the audience to continue to submit them. Yes, Kevin.
Well, thank you, Massimo, and thank you to both panelists for very enlightening remarks. Also, I'm glad to see the positive reaction to the report and its findings. Look, I have a question for Tom. Both Seema and during her presentation, but also Tom mentioned inevitably the issue, the emerging issue of the role of artificial intelligence in the context of elections. And of course, that's sort of the flavor of the month and the year, because we've all been talking about the different implications of artificial intelligence in everything we do. Yet, I have the distinct impression that when it comes to elections, we've seen a relatively limited impact in this huge election cycle in 2024. Honestly, the closest thing to an electorally relevant impact that I've seen is Taylor Swift getting very angry about, one of the candidates using an AI-generated image to claim that she had endorsed him. But other than that, we've seen very little, as far as I can tell. So my question to you, Tom, and also to Ines, if she wants to come in as well. Have we overemphasized the issue of the potential impact of artificial intelligence, and have we created a monster where there might be none?
It's a fascinating approach, Kevin. I would agree with you about what we've seen to date. I was in the UK for their election, and they expected to see a lot. And the reverse of that, they saw very little of the impact of AI. I mean, we are seeing it growing. It's just another mode of mis and disinformation in many ways. There's a famous quote that King Charles II shut down coffee shops in London in 1695 because he was annoyed about fake news that was being spread in these coffee shops. So this has been with us for a long time, but the difference, the potential difference with AI, I think it can produce stuff, if I can use 3 V words, at volume and a velocity that we've never seen before. And the third V word, with a verifiability that we've never seen before. So it's producing stuff on a scale we're potentially not seeing. So then the second issue is we've been talking about the importance of perception with electoral integrity. What we're seeing through surveys, including what we're talking about here, is the public are worried about AI. So I'm not sure whether we've over-egged the pudding, created that as an issue, but it's a perception issue at the very least that we need to deal with. There are a couple of parliamentary inquiries running in Australia at the moment looking at this issue. There is a lot of noise about it. I think we will wait to see also what we see in the US. We've seen, as you said, the great Taylor Swift issue and a few other bits and pieces, but we're watching closely. I think there is potential for it to be a very significant issue, but I admit we haven't seen a lot of it yet. I'm not sure whether Ines has got a view on that.
Ines?
So, yeah, I want to repeat everything that Tom has said, which is really relevant, and it's basically goes to the point. But I think there's I wouldn't say we have overestimated actually the dangers and the problems of AI, and especially AI generated and disseminated disinformation. Of course, I mean, maybe we are not yet seeing all of it, and maybe some of the things we expected to see this year of the super election year haven't materialized. But maybe we were looking at the wrong thing. We were expecting to see like more candidates appearing as holograms and fake voices on the phone and that kind of thing. And we are actually seeing AI, the effects of AI, without seeing it, because what we're seeing is, well, disinformation, for example, that is produced and disseminated with AI, right? And this is a huge problem, and it's going to be even worse. I mean, it's the problem of disinformation as intentional, massive, insidious, and taking advantage of the logic of social media algorithms, I mean, that's something we really don't know yet how to tackle. We are only just beginning to understand what hit us. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's no, we haven't overestimated at all, I think.
Well, and if I may wear my hat as Global Programs Director, we have a Digitalization and Democracy program, and we are looking both at the threats and the challenges posed by AI in electoral processes, and also the opportunities, because some of the election management authorities and bodies are actually increasingly using AI for their mandate. Let me just pose two final questions before we open up the Q&A to the audience. And the first one is for Ines. We found that elections are being disputed, as Seema reported from the Global State of Democracy reports of this year, at relatively high rates, including via boycotts, public rejection of results, and court cases. Are these healthy demonstrations of democratic voice, or are they cause for worry? What do you think, Ines?
Okay. So I'm not sure you're presenting me with a real option, like an either or response here, because some of these could be healthy demonstrations of, democratic voice, while also being a cause for concern. And you're also not mentioning, another form of dispute that the report actually mentions several times, but, for a variety of reasons, it's not included in the analysis, which is post-election violence, which is obviously a cause for worry. But the report also makes a key point that I think is it really matters is, who mobilizes these disputes and why. So, for example, boycotts, they are typically driven by opposition groups when the very low quality of the election doesn't really give them the slightest chance. So they can be a healthy demonstration of democratic voice, as you put it, right? Resulting in, very low turnouts. And of course, I mean, low turnouts are bad for democracy, but in a non-democracy, they can be a powerful message. The incumbent, may claim a victory with a crazy, implausibly high percentage of the vote, but on a very low turnout that contradicts their claims. And if they falsify the turnout numbers, of course, there's always, the photographic testimony of empty polling places, no people in the streets, no queues anywhere. So the whole purpose of this kind of election is is for an authoritarian regime to acquire some veneer of legitimacy, and legitimacy is elusive, which, message delivered, that's great. So same when it comes, to the public rejection of the results. Um, uh, Here's, I think, when it also becomes clear how important expert assessments are, not just, public perceptions, but because, for example, even if you sort of take the case of the US, you acknowledge there are problems with, voter suppression, that kind of thing, which, if anything, benefited rather than harmed the chances of the candidate that complained after the elections about the results. But there is agreement that the system has relatively high levels of integrity. So compare it with the recent elections in Venezuela, where the only independent observer that was there said the election was nowhere close to free and fair, and the government refused to show the vote tallies and instead announced a made-up election result that favored the incumbent. So no electoral integrity at all here, right? So in both cases, there were instances of public rejection of the results. Now, in one case, this public rejection of the results lacked any factual evidence. It was, just a tactic of the losing party that wanted to win at any cost. And this is obviously a cause for worry. In the other case, the Democratic opposition won the election, which was actually really stolen from it. So the fact that people mobilized first to defend the integrity of the voting process, and this was incredible. I mean, there was a very well coordinated operation in which opposition people, like citizens that supported the opposition, compiled the voting tallies in each polling place, then put it all together, calculated the results, and then they took to the streets to defend the real results against the fake ones announced by the government. And this is not a cause for concern. I mean, this was, I think, a demonstration of democratic conviction and resilience. So what was a cause for concern was the violence that followed. And in contrast with the other case, the US, this was not violence instigated by those rejecting the results. It was a violence unleashed by the government trying to dissolve the protests of those demanding respect for the will of the people expressed in the polls. So the comparison between these two cases also shows, what happens when it comes to court cases. That's the other form of rejection that or contention that you mentioned. So judicial procedures were abused in the US by Trump supporters trying to get through the courts the victory that the polls hadn't given them. And they could do that because recourse to the courts is open to all citizens, as it should in a democracy. Venezuelans don't stand a chance in their country's courts because they are packed with government supporters and lack any independence. So here you go. I mean, my answer is, of course, I mean, it depends. All these things can mean very, very different things in different contexts.
Thanks, Ines. My last question for Tom is about an evidence provided in the report, which indicates that people's perceptions are often disproportionately focused on polling station activities and vote counting. So what would you recommend that election authorities and political elites do to help strengthen trust in these aspects of the electoral cycle? Tom?
Thanks, Massimo. Look, I'll keep my answer relatively brief so we can potentially take a couple of other questions. But I think for me, it's actually doing a lot of work before the event rather than doing it at the event to try and strengthen trust when things have already occurred. In Australia, we've launched a thing called our reputation management strategy, which really helps us do proactive messaging with the public right through the electoral cycle, not just at election time. If I give you a live example, we did a referendum last year where we're one of the most trusted institutions in Australia. And we were attacked during the referendum for reasons I won't go into. And our own research showed that the trust ratings for the public went from 9 out of 10 down to 8 out of 10 during that attack. And then straight after the event, it immediately bounced back up to 9 out of 10 because we spent some years trying to educate the public on those aspects of election, how they work, and why they are very strong. And I think the message is all of that work has to be done before the event. The research shows debunking doesn't work. You have to do it to correct the record. Doesn't persuade anyone. Pre-bunking works a heck of a lot more, and uplifting citizens' digital literacy and understanding about those issues works a lot more than that. We've been doing that, and I think the report shows that as well. You've got to build that trust with the public. And I think I might leave it there, Massimo, so we can perhaps take some other questions as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. In fact, we have a couple of questions from YouTube, and I opened them up also to Kevin and Sima here if they want to answer to them. The first one is from Nurul Huda. The question is, what should be the efforts to promote interest in fair elections among voters? And then there is the second question from Claudia Arajuco. What specific actions would you say civil society needs to invest in and amplify to make an effective contribution towards safeguarding democracy and fighting pro-authoritarian efforts? So, interest in fair elections and voters, and investment by civil society in order to make an effective contribution to fight pro-authoritarian pushbacks. So, who wants to come into this? Maybe Ines, the second one is addressed to you, and the first one is addressed to Tom. Ines, do you want to start?
Okay, let's do that. So the question is, what specific action civil society needs to invest in to make an effective contribution um, to fight? What could you repeat the question? I don't.
To fight pro-authoritarian efforts.
Okay, so well, civil society. I mean, it's not alone in this fight, and actually, it works in coalitions, not just civil society coalitions, but also with election authorities, and so it's not civil society against the state or civil society against the world, but so many of the things civil society promotes, and many of the things it does, because around elections, civil society does a lot of voter education work, and also advocates for governments to do certain things that only governments can do. For example, one of the big issues of concern around elections is election disinformation, right? So what civil society does, and what civil society promotes as actions that need to be done. Well, there are some things that civil society can do and does, and have to do with educating the public about elections, about the processes. A lot of the things that create lack of credibility and lack of trust is basically not knowing how the system works. So there's understanding the process, and it's also being able to detect disinformation, and not become sort of unwitting agents of misinformation, right? Because that's what people does. I mean, normally just normal people, citizens, don't create this information. There's factories of this information. There's troll farms that put this information out there, and then it's pushed by the algorithms. But then once it gets to us, if we're not ready to understand and to identify it, then we start disseminating it. We become parts of the machines. So yes, I mean, there's a big role for civil society to play there, but at the same time, it's sort of trying to how do you say this in English? Sorry, it's sort of trying to just to cover the sun with your hand. It's doing so little if you don't work on the source of the problem, right? And that's also where civil society advocates for governments to understand the problem better, and to regulate this better. For example, to understand how to regulate social media platforms in a way that doesn't conflict with the freedom of expression. But it's a big deal, but that, of course, I mean, civil society has no authority to make any of these decisions that are for political for governments to do. So yeah, that's where civil society actually advocates for governments to take certain approaches to regulation. So yeah, I would say these two things are really important. There are others, but yeah, let's stop there.
Thanks a lot, Ines, especially for answering to my question so quickly. It's Tom, the issue of civic education and how to promote interest in fair elections among voters. Do you have any recommendations or insights on that?
Massimo, if I was being a bit facetious, I'd say introduce compulsory voting the way that we've done it. But in the absence of that, I would say that constant communication with citizens and a big reach into the community outside of the electoral cycle is critical for election management bodies. At election time, that's also important, and we have an enormous reach. The referendum I mentioned recently, we ran, I think, the largest reach of any Australian government campaign ever with our citizens. We had 1 billion impressions on social media, which is fantastic. But just restricting it to those sorts of campaigns is not sufficient to generate an interest in free and fair elections and participation. It has to be constant. And the other thing, I think, is it can't just be one modality. You really have to think about how those messages are hitting with various demographic groups, and you have to try and cover the field with a whole range of different things And I think good MBs do that. We certainly do, from various social media platforms that I'm not familiar with, given my own demographic, through to still standard, TV, radio, reaching into the community, reaching into schools in particular, I think is very critical. So that's how you do it, that constant communication, building trust with the community that you're always there, not just at campaign time, I think is a critical part of the process. It's something we do. It does seem to pay dividends. And I know when I talk to my peer EMB agencies, the good ones tend to do the same thing as well.
So looking at the election cycle as a whole, not simply at the time of elections. Great point. I have both Kevin and Seema would like to say something. Please, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, on the question of, how to entice the interest of citizens in elections, I think this goes well beyond elections. I mean, this is about the workings of democracy writ large. I mean, the single best way to entice the interest and the participation of citizens in elections is if they have the conviction that elections make a difference, are able to produce political change, that there's something at stake when they go to the polls. And I say the word something at stake very deliberately, because here I'm reminded of something that a very prominent political scientist, Adam Przeworski, mentions in one of his recent books, that democratic elections work well when there's something at stake, but not too much or too little, right? If there's too much at stake, then people go crazy, right? I mean, that's when you have the highly polarized environments that, where people and political leaders are able to are willing to go to any length to prevail. And when there's too little at stake, it really makes no difference and people have no incentive to go to the polls. So there has to be something at stake. And that, to me, is the single most powerful way to convince people that it's worth participating in elections, both by simply voting, but also exercising their active political rights to run for office.
Seema?
I would just add that I think one of the things our report shows is that people are interested in credible elections. It's not that they aren't, they are. That's why we see rates of protest and riot increasing. It's just that they're not showing the interest in the traditional way of going to the ballot box. That doesn't mean that they're not invested. In fact, I think it shows that they're more invested because they're willing to risk their lives in some cases to go out and do that. I would say, just to add that, I think to pick up on something that Tom said is that and something that Inez said, legitimacy and the perception of legitimacy are the same thing. And that's really important because it is voters who provide that ultimate legitimacy to an electoral outcome. That's why elections are the foundation of democracies. And I think one of the problems that comes up in the narrative is when experts say, in response to a surprising poll result, for example, oh, well, that's the wrong definition of democracy. So that means people aren't sophisticated enough to understand something as complex as democracy. Instead, I think we should be saying, oh, that's a surprising result. Maybe we should think about how we need to change our conception of democracy based on what people understand it to be, rather than dismissing those claims. And maybe that would allow us to sort of reorient our work around citizens, which is what Tom said. We have to reorient electoral processes around citizens and voters.
Thank you very much. Maybe before I try to wrap up, which is an impossible mission, I ask both Tom and Inez if they want to say in just 1 minute something before we close. Do you have any key messages that you want to convey at this stage? No, Ines is overwhelmed, so that's okay. And Tom too. So let me try then to wrap up and then hand it over for closing. The first point I think it emerged clearly from this conversation is the importance of combining quantitative and qualitative analysis. Even these last comments made by Seema, building on the comments previously made on expert and public perceptions, show the richness of an analysis that take into account at the same time these two perspectives. Too often, reporting on democracy trends take either a qualitative or a quantitative way. Combining the two is, I think, an important effort and probably the niche that this report fills. On the other hand, it's also interesting what it can offer to all the actors involved in this space, because we are trying also to provide recommendations. And a couple of the recommendations resonated very well with the examples that you provided. I was struck by the reference to the contestation of results and the ambivalence element that Ines explained in her reply to that. I'm struck, for example, by the fact that it's difficult to entirely rig elections when you have infrastructures in place that may provide ammunition exactly to the opposition, when they can make use of the analysis made available by the very infrastructure that was built in order to have strong electoral institutions in place. And on the other hand, it is very, very important as well to focus on addressing new challenges, including the challenges that come from technological innovation. There were many references to social media, the space, which is also a cyberspace where election competition takes place. So thank you very much for your participation and engagement in this conversation, Ines and Tom, and over to Jessica.
Thank you, Massimo. On behalf of International IDEA, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to the distinguished speakers. Thank you, Ines, and thank you, Tom, and to our moderator, Massimo, for leading such an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. I also want to thank everyone who joined online and actively participated in the conversation. As we conclude this event, I would like to invite you to read the 2024 Global State of Democracy report. Links to the report can be found on International IDEA's social media pages, as well as via the QR code displayed on your screen. I would like to remind you about our platform, the Democracy Tracker, which offers monthly updates on democracy and human rights developments across 173 countries. You can access it at idea.int/democracy tracker. We sincerely hope that you will continue to engage with International IDEA's work. Thank you once again for your participation.